Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming to this webinar, Everything You Need to Know About .NET 6 and Professional Desktop Application. My name is Greg Lutz. I'm a product manager at ComponentOne, or actually at Grape City. I'm the product manager for ComponentOne. In our webinar today, I will go over some of the key takeaways and highlights from .NET 6, specifically for desktop development, and I'll discuss why you may or may not want to migrate to .NET 6. I will touch upon the current status of the .NET framework as well, and where it stands compared to .NET 6. I'll also focus on demonstrating some ComponentOne controls for WinForms and WPF using .NET 6 in Visual Studio 2022. So specifically, how to migrate an application to .NET 6. I'll show how to data bind a FlexGrid at design time using Entity Framework, and I'll show off some of the designer support we have with this first .NET 6 release, including suggested actions and XAML hot reload in WPF. Finally, I will share our roadmap for the next year. The ComponentOne controls are designed to help .NET developers create polished and professional looking desktop applications in less time. So now let's jump into some of these .NET 6 benefits. I can't go into as much detail on everything .NET 6 has to offer. For that, you should refer to Microsoft's blogs and videos. Microsoft just released .NET 6 on November 8th last week, and they've announced all the details during the .NET conference. They've positioned .NET 6 to be the first long-term support .NET version that will support a single runtime or SDK to build all of these different types of applications from desktop to web to mobile. And with the upcoming inclusion of Maui, which will be the successor to Xamarin and run on .NET 6, it will bring in mobile development for Mac and iOS and Android devices. With Xamarin Forms, you could write a single app for Android, iOS, and UWP on Windows. And Maui is essentially the same as Xamarin Forms for that cross-platform, single application model approach. Plus, Microsoft announced that Blazor will be part of the action here with Maui. So you could also include a web target in your deployment. Maui is still in preview, but it should be in production early next year. And I'll also share the ComponentOne plans at the end of as part of our roadmap. So .NET 6 is really continuing this unified vision of having a single .NET runtime that can be used everywhere across the desktop, web, and mobile. Next, and perhaps the biggest benefit to migrating to .NET 6 is the performance improvements. Last year with .NET 5, it was released as sort of like this intermediate stepping stone between .NET Framework and .NET 6, with just 1 year of committed support by Microsoft. So with .NET 5, we saw some areas of performance enhancements, specifically with JSON serialization and sockets. But .NET 6 has a lot more focus on improving performance, specifically with the Entity Framework. According to Microsoft, .NET 6 is now 92% faster than .NET 5 with Entity Framework. And that's for all of your data management. And there's also some web development improvements I wanted to include here, especially for Blazor WebAssembly. Blazor WebAssembly apps are a great way to take a desktop app to the web, kind of like how Silverlight was back in the day. And now it builds and runs much faster, thanks to improvements in the ahead of time compiling. We've also published some performance metrics on our end for the ComponentOne controls I wanted to share. So here we have published a very detailed report on the performance for FlexGrid and WinForms, comparing .NET 5 to .NET Framework. So we're seeing the same, if not better, performance in .NET 6, which is why I wanted to keep this now slightly outdated blog post in the limelight. For details, you can follow this URL or just go to the Grape City site and search for FlexGrid performance. The benchmarks compare performance in several areas important for data grids, like generating and assigning data, painting, scrolling, sorting, and filtering. And as you can see here, across the board, we're seeing better performance or less memory usage, which is a good thing. We also have a similar blog for the WPF FlexGrid, which you can check out. So back to some of the .NET 6 stuff. And for all of the desktop developers out there, there are some other quality of life improvements, such as the Visual Studio 2022 being released. And with that comes some enhanced debugging and testing tools. The hot reload feature is perhaps the most visible new feature. And at ComponentOne, we've also rewritten a lot of our design time tooling to support the new .NET Core-based designer. And I'll demonstrate some of this and the hot reload in a bit. There's a new version of C#, version 10, which includes some quality of life coding improvements. Two that stand out to me, which are great time-saving features, are the global using statement for the entire project, as well as the shorter notation for namespaces. So typically we keep files and namespaces in sync, meaning it's not common to put more than one namespace in one file. So this new notation realizes that and saves time, reducing all the brackets and the indentation complexity of your code files. And lastly here, the ARM64 support is added for desktop development and also added in .NET Framework. So now you can build optimized modern UIs on the ARM64 architecture to support larger code bases and workflows. So those are some of the highlights of .NET 6. But now you might be wondering, why bother to migrate your .NET Framework app to .NET 6? Last year, we covered several of these topics on migration from .NET Framework to .NET 5. All that information remains the same if you're migrating from .NET Framework now to .NET 6. But first, you should determine why you want or need to migrate. For many, it will be for the performance improvements promised with .NET 5 and 6. And .NET 5 also introduced some deployment flexibility, which I want to repeat. So for instance, you can now package your entire desktop application as a single file. So one executable for your entire desktop application. Now that, I believe, still requires the end user's machine to have .NET Framework installed. But you have another option where you can now publish your application on a machine that does not have .NET Framework installed. And essentially all the .NET runtime that's necessary is packaged along with your application in multiple files. Microsoft has since released a new utility called the .NET Upgrade Assistant. Now, the .NET Upgrade Assistant is a .NET global tool that helps you incrementally upgrade your .NET Framework-based WinForms, WPF, or even MVC apps to .NET 6. It's a guided step-by-step tutorial, and it also supports VB.NET in addition to C#. And this is sort of an evolution of the .NET Portability Analyzer and the Try-Convert tool, which we covered in our previous webinars. However, if you're already at .NET 5, then to upgrade to .NET 6 is very straightforward. It's as easy as just setting the target type in your project file. And if you're using ComponentOne controls, you'll also want to swap those out for .NET 6 controls. So let me show how easy this is. So last week, we also released our .NET 6 controls for WinForms and WPF exclusively to NuGet for preview. And we will be including them complete in our installers with our 2021 V3 release next month. And we also have samples on GitHub. So the quickest way to get started is you just grab the samples off of GitHub, and then the samples will automatically pull in the packages for you. So let me jump over to Visual Studio here. And here I have a .NET 5 WinForms project that is using ComponentOne Ribbon, Flex Report, and Flex Viewer. Okay. So to update this to .NET 6, I'll just right-click the project file, go to Properties, and in here, we just set the target framework to .NET 6. And once we do that, Visual Studio updates things automatically for us in the background. Then to update the ComponentOne libraries, I will open the NuGet Package Manager. Notice that the 6.0 versions are now available on NuGet.org. And on the Updates tab, select every ComponentOne control that you want to update. And make sure that if you're staying with .NET 5 for some time, not to accidentally update to the 6.0 versions. But if you do, it's not that difficult to roll back. The ComponentOne controls do not have any breaking changes from .NET 5 to .NET 6. And also, if you're sticking with .NET 5, just keep in mind, we will be releasing one more major update of our .NET 5 controls in our V3 release next month. That'll include some big controls like TrueDB Grid and Scheduler. So now the packages are updated, and that's it. Now the project should build and run. Now this all works in theory. Microsoft has also published a list of breaking changes in .NET 6. They appear to mostly be related to ASP.NET Core, but you can find details on this in their documentation. So here it is running as a .NET 6 application with very minimal work done. Of course, this is one of our simple samples that I just migrated just for an example. And lastly here, going back to the question of migrating, keep in mind that the .NET framework will be supported for as long as Windows is shipping. Microsoft has made that clear. So for ComponentOne, we're going to continue to support the latest .NET framework versions with new features and enhancements, so long as developers continue to use it. And Microsoft has also announced that more older versions of .NET Framework will stop being supported next year, while at the same time they announced a new update to .NET Framework 4.8. That's like the main highlight there is that they're adding in the ARM64 architecture support. Now, if you stick with .NET Framework, you will want to update to .NET 4.62 or higher during next year. The good news is that migrating between versions of .NET Framework is relatively easy, pretty much exactly like I just showed from migrating 5 to 6. The bigger leap is from .NET Framework 5 to .NET 5 or 6. I'm sorry, from .NET Framework to .NET 5 or 6. So next, I will talk a bit more about what ComponentOne has to offer for .NET 6 development and show the controls in a bit more depth using Visual Studio 2022. So what does ComponentOne offer? So for those of you that don't have much experience working with the ComponentOne controls, ComponentOne provides hundreds of UI controls for every .NET platform, essentially to fill in the gaps left by the toolbox. The toolbox controls are essentially provided by .NET itself. We sometimes say they're Microsoft controls. If you're building an application UI, you will typically use a lot of those standard controls to create your layout, like the buttons and the labels and the text boxes, the very basic stuff. .NET even provides some more advanced controls like a data grid in most platforms. We tend to follow Microsoft's lead on the support lifecycle. However, we do often support our controls for longer, depending on what developers are using. For example, in this chart, you can see we supported the .NET 2 controls for a lot longer than Microsoft supported the framework itself. And that was because it was so popular, people were using it for so long. ComponentOne provides a lot of advanced controls you can't find in the toolbox. Plus, we add more features to common controls to replace the standard .NET ones. An example of an advanced control that you won't find in the toolbox for WinForms is our ribbon UI control. Now, let me show you some of these controls in Visual Studio 2022 and their design time support. So here I have a blank new WinForms .NET 6 application. To start working with ComponentOne .NET 6 controls, open the NuGet package manager and browse for the c1.win libraries, like c1.win.ribbon includes the ribbon controls. Select that and install to the application. Now, if you fully installed the controls from our website, we also will install these packages locally too. But working with NuGet.org is nice because you can get started very quickly. And if you read the details in the README for the packages, you can find links to resources. Once the packages are added, they will appear in the toolbox. Find the C1 ribbon control and drop it to the form. The design time support for .NET 6 is a bit limited compared to what it was in the .NET framework, for anyone familiar with that. That's because Microsoft rewrote the designer and we had to rewrite all of the design tools. But this design time support will become richer with future versions. But from the design surface, you can select some objects and add items to the ribbon by going through the tabs and groups collections in the property grid at this moment. So for example, here, let's open up the tabs collection. And then, so a ribbon is composed of tabs, which is then composed of groups and then composed of items. So then, here we could add tabs, and then to each tab, we can add multiple groups to group all of our buttons. And then I'm going to go into here to the groups and then go into the items. And from here is where I can actually add all of my buttons and whatnot. So I'm going to add a button to this first group, change the text. Now, the ribbon also includes a built-in library of stock vector images using our C1 icon. So all these icons you can use royalty-free. So let me locate an icon for this button by browsing this library. Of course, you can also provide your own icons. And then once we selected the icon, let me close out of all these windows. But to save time in building this ribbon, I previously saved a layout to XML. So that's one nice way if you're moving from one application to another. You don't have to recreate your ribbon using C1 ribbon. You could just export it and then load it into another application. So that's what I'm going to do here. Just import this ribbon layout, and now my entire ribbon will be populated. So it would take a lot of time for you to program a control like this yourself. I mean, and you or your developers would focus so much time and energy worrying about all these little things like the layout and the theming. Whereas when you use a third-party control like C1 ribbon, it's ready to go out of the box. In fact, it's a lot of fun to build these UI controls where you don't even have to write any code. You can just start building your ribbon UI by adding buttons, images, and then wire up the click events right inside Visual Studio on the design surface. An example of an improved standard control that I want to talk about is, of course, our flex grid. So flex grid is an advanced data grid control. So not only does it work with data binding, but its unbound capabilities make it easier to customize than the standard data grid view. So let me show how to add flex grid to this ribbon form and populate it using the entity framework. So to start, let's add the packages for the .NET6 C1 flex grid. So it's going to be in the c1.win.flexgrid library. Locate the 6.0 version and install it just like we did with C1 ribbon. Accept the licensing and whatnot. Now, I also plan to show some data binding. So I'm going to add the Microsoft Entity Framework core library to my project here. And specifically, I'm going to bind to a local copy of the Northwind database using SQLite. So I'm going to not only add the Microsoft Entity Framework core library, but I'm also going to add the SQL Server, Microsoft Entity Framework core.SQL Server library. So as you're going to see in a bit, this is sort of like the new desired way that Microsoft wants you to work with data binding in new projects in WinForms. So once you've added the FlexGrid control library, you can now go back to your toolbox and drag it to the form. And here I'm going to just dock it below my ribbon. So FlexGrid for WinForms has a smart tag. Like as you see here, with more quick property configurations available. Plus, there's a lot more settings in the property grid. You may have noticed in Visual Studio 2022 that Microsoft has deprecated the data source panel for WinForms. So we can no longer build data sets through this wizard. We now need to use other approaches like I'm going to show you with the entity framework. So what I want to do here is data bind FlexGrid to the customer table for my database using entity framework. To do that, I had to define this customer class here in C#. In addition, I had to write this DB context class that contains a DB set collection of our business objects. This also includes the URL, the actual link to our database. And to complete this data binding, drop a binding source component to the component tray by just double clicking it, and then go and open up its data source property in the property grid, and then select add new object data source. And then select your business object class. I only have the one here, customer. And then back in the data source editor, that should then now appear as the available data sources. So drill down in there, select customer. Then select the FlexGrid and set its data source to our binding source. Now up to this point, this would be the same for any .NET data grid. But now that we've bound it to FlexGrid, now we're free to go ahead and do whatever we want with FlexGrid. Lastly, we have to load the data in the form event through the DB context that we created. This is probably going to be very specific depending upon your application. I just wrote something very quick here that just loads it. And after adding that, we can build and see the application. So customizing FlexGrid can be seen in many of our samples. Like in this showcase demo, FlexGrid is known for its flexibility, hence the name. So you have complete control, however, each cell is rendered, and you can access the values in each cell, something that might seem obvious, but not as easy in most data-bound UI controls. And this is helpful for those unique customization scenarios. So of course, you can put custom elements in the cells. You can apply conditional formatting, grouping, aggregation, all of that. Now, for WPF developers, it's basically the same story. Let me quickly build a WPF sample application to show a ComponentOne control and how its design time is different in Visual Studio 2022. To create a new .NET 6 application, just look for the project templates that say .NET without any mention of .NET Framework. So here I select the WPF application and then kept it at the .NET 6 framework. And like I did with the WinForms projects, I need to add the ComponentOne WPF libraries from NuGet. So let me go ahead and do that. So for this project, I'm just going to show FlexGrid in this example. And when you find the C1.WPF FlexGrid, make sure you install the 6.0 version. Accept the license text. And then open up the XAML main page, the main window. And then you can look for FlexGrid in the toolbox once this loads. And you can drop it to the page. Now with WPF, you may need to build the application in order for the control to appear correctly. Otherwise, sometimes the control just appears as an empty box until it's built and it recognizes the components. In .NET 6, we've improved this suggested actions menu for all of our WPF controls. So this can be opened by clicking the little light bulb on the top right corner of the control. And this gives you quick access to key properties and features and behaviors, just like the smart tag feature did in WinForms. So now you can do a lot more in WPF with writing less code. And not only can you set the properties, but you can also perform more complex actions. So for example, to implement the filter row in the WPF FlexGrid, it requires some special XAML markup. But by clicking this enable filter row link in the suggested actions, the XAML automatically gets generated and added for you. So that saves you time having to not only discover that, but also to actually write it. Now, one of the other new features for WPF in all XAML development platforms in Visual Studio 2022 is the XAML hot reload feature. So with XAML hot reload, you can incrementally build and test XAML markup with the benefit of running the app's data context. So it's helpful for all that UI tweaking that we do. So rather than setting one property, building it, and then changing it to something else, we can save time by just modifying the XAML during debug. So this is obviously best done on a dual screen. Otherwise, you have to like share half your screen or you keep minimizing and maximizing windows. But the good news is that this feature works great with ComponentOne WPF controls, as I'm demonstrating here with this FlexGrid demo. And I've changed some style settings and enabled column dragging or reordering. So anything in XAML that you can modify gets automatically updated. You can also control the hot reload using the little flame button that's to the left of the run button. So that's the end of my demos showing these ComponentOne controls. Lastly, in this webinar, I want to go over our roadmap. So for those of you who are already using ComponentOne controls and looking to see us complete our .NET 6 migration, I can share that we are mostly there. With the addition of C1 TrueDB Grid, Gantt View, and Scheduler in WinForms and WPF, we're now adding some of the last big controls. So for WPF, we've also added List View and Multi-Select. And at this point, more controls are ported than not. So let me just share the list of controls that we still plan to port into 2022. So here are the controls that still remain that we'll complete in early 2022. So for WinForms, it's Chart 3D, Dashboard, Editor, Multi-Select, Gauges, Radial Menu Sizer, Tile Control, and Word. And WPF has 3D Chart as well, Flex Sheet, Gauges, Gantt View, Expression Editor, Flex Report, Input Panel, Rating, and such. So also in 2022, our roadmap looks like this. So our 2021 V3 release will be the last release with .NET 5 controls, especially with like new features, all the new controls we're talking about. But we will continue to support the .NET 5 controls as they're finalized with the V3 release for at least one more year. It means that any new features we add in 2022, including new controls, will be only in .NET 6. Microsoft, as you may know or may not know, Microsoft has committed to 1 year of support for .NET 5, 3 years for .NET 6. For .NET 6, we will complete the migration of the controls that I just previously listed. And again, we will have at least 3 years of support, just like Microsoft. But this will also depend upon if people are using it. Because like I showed in that earlier chart, we supported .NET 2 for a very long time. So it really depends on what people are using. So our support may be longer. It'll depend upon the demand. In 3 years' time, we'll be talking about .NET 8 and .NET 9. So we'll see. And also for .NET Framework, we will also release a new version of our WinForms controls for .NET 4.8. And this will allow us to support some of the latest features in .NET Framework, such as high resolution, which you can only get now using .NET 5 or 6. We will also continue to maintain our .NET 4.52 controls, but as Microsoft has announced, 4.52 is ending on their end mid-2022. So you can expect to see that at some point in 2022, where we will put new features and new enhancements into .NET 4.8, and the 4.52 controls will enter maintenance mode. So what maintenance mode means is that we support it, but we just don't add the new fun stuff to it. So some of the additional platforms I want to mention here, this whole webinar we focused on WinForms and WPF because they've had the most changes and the most interest with .NET 5 and 6, but some of our other platforms are also going to be updated shortly. So our 2021 V3 release next month will include support or .NET 6 support for Blazor, WinUI, and ASP.NET Core MVC. We also plan to release a preview of our MAUI controls, specifically FlexGrid and Calendar in the first wave by the end of the year. And we hope to release these along with the Microsoft timeline for releasing MAUI next year. Right now, the feedback from our developers is the MAUI platform is a bit shaky, and we can see why it's not ready to be released at this moment and why Microsoft had delayed it. Some other updates for you existing customers and users out there. So for UWP and Xamarin, these platforms will be entering maintenance mode, which, like I said, means we continue to fix bugs and support it for years to come, but we will not be adding new enhancements and features to these platforms. Instead, we are shifting focus to WinUI and MAUI, which essentially replace these platforms. And once we officially announce it in our forums, the 2-year support window begins. And that 2-year support window is also based upon feedback that we get from existing users. So that about wraps it up for everything I want to share today. So I thank everybody for attending. If you have any questions, feel free to reach us at this email on the screen. So thank you, everybody, and have a nice day.